After the military coup in Myanmar, the European Union claims it wants to put pressure on the country's new leaders. But it appears to have done nothing so far other than condemn the takeover and say it's ready to impose sanctions. Is it time for the bloc to be more forceful? This is Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The European Union doesn't want to stop trade with Myanmar and doesn't want to hurt what it calls the most vulnerable. What can it realistically do? European Union leaders have condemned the Myanmar regime and are set to impose sanctions against its military leaders. Visa bans and asset freezes on the new junta would come on top of existing EU measures, which were imposed due to the previous government's persecution of the Rohingya minority. But the new measures are unlikely to touch trade after the EU claimed it was seeking to avoid trade sanctions, which could hurt the people of Myanmar. The European Union is also Myanmar's third biggest trading partner. And with Myanmar coming under China's sphere of influence, relations with Beijing come into play. China has blocked a UN Security Council statement condemning the military coup in Myanmar and has been accused by protesters of backing Myanmar's generals. And it has protected Myanmar from criticism at the UN over the crackdown on the Muslim minority Rohingya. So is the EU being tough enough? And would sanctions make a difference? Well, we are going to get the conversation going now. Let me introduce to you out of London, Ronan Lee, who wrote A Politician, Not an Icon, Aung San Suu Kyi's Silence on Myanmar's Muslim Rohingya. Also in London, Anna Roberts, Executive Director of the Burma Campaign UK. And then we go to Copenhagen, where we see Jonas Parello-Plesner, Executive Director at the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, formerly a diplomat in the Danish Foreign Office in the early 2000s, working on Myanmar sanctions. And Jonas, I'm going to start with you first of all, since you are a former diplomat, you know how to couch these things. Is the European Union being cowardly?
I wouldn't put it that way. I think the European Union has come up with a pretty sort of a response to the situation and is now looking at sanctions, which is targeted sanctions on the generals that are behind this coup. And I think that's a necessary step. I think we have to move further, maybe than just sanctions on a couple of generals, but also on their companies, where it would really hurt. I'm not sure the European Union is ready for that yet. And it's, of course, it's composed of 27 member states, so it has to get everybody on board. But Borrell, the foreign minister of the EU, has been pretty sort of outspoken on this. So, and then I think it's really important that we get not just the EU, but like the US, which has already enacted sanctions, but all democratic countries basically to say this is outrageous and do the same. That would be really sort of the best way, if at all, to change the military's calculus on this.
Well, we'll talk about the effectiveness of particular types of sanctions in just a moment. But Anna, let me come to you. You are not a diplomat. Do you think the European Union is at best being laggardly, at worst cowardly?
They're definitely moving dangerously slowly. Yeah, it took 3 weeks after the coup for the EU to hold a meeting in which the conclusion was that they announced they were standing ready to act and they were going to look into what measures that they could take. So far, the only practical action that the EU has taken is the existing visa bans on generals, and that just amounts to a holiday ban because they never come to Europe anyway. And the asset freeze is symbolic because they don't have any assets in the EU to freeze. So, and I think, they also announced that they would announce measures at their next meeting on the 22nd of March. So it's really not good enough that they're taking so long to announce measures. There is a sort of half positive announcement in that they're looking at targeted sanctions on the military, but as yet we've not seen any practical action that would have an impact on this yet from the EU.
Let's bring you in, Ronan. I know you met Aung San Suu Kyi around about 10 years ago. I'll talk to you about your relationship or your impressions of her a little bit later in the programme. But I want to ask you about what you consider to be the importance, or perhaps lack of importance, of the European Union in all of this. Does it have very much influence?
Well, it does. It's perceived by Myanmar's military as still as very influential within the country in terms of the legitimacy of the military. The military looks to bodies like the EU to gauge how they are being perceived internationally. And the EU's been very slow out of the blocks. I mean, the EU, in terms of responding to the coup, is in both rhetoric and policy, it's well below what we've seen from the United States, for instance. I mean, very quick rhetoric, at least from the United States, and some actions that followed in response to the coup. The EU hasn't been like that. And that sends a signal to Myanmar's military, of course. That signals to the military that the EU's not quite as bothered with what's going on within Myanmar as other countries might be. And that's pretty dangerous at this point in time. I mean, what the military are looking for is a sense of legitimacy. They're looking also to project that onto their own population. I mean, they want to express to the population of Myanmar that they are being perceived as legitimate internationally. So in my view, I think it's pretty dangerous, the slow pace of EU response.
Okay, is that because of vested interests?
Look, I think it must be. The EU's taken a sort of a development-first approach to its engagement with Myanmar. I mean, it's always talked about engaging with Myanmar and engaging even with the military. They've provided, for instance, training for Myanmar police over the last 5 years. And it's couched that in terms of engagement. But the military, of course, has seen that as accommodation rather than engagement. The EU appears to be very defensive of policies such as the training of police that might be perceived as accommodating the military. And I mean, I think the only reason you could do that, or the only reason you would do that if you were a body like the EU, was if you wanted to defend other interests that you might have within Myanmar. And of course, the problem is that the EU should not be seeing the people of Myanmar as an economic opportunity. The people of Myanmar have democratic aspirations, and they don't want people accommodating military rule.
Jonas, before I read out something from Joseph Borrell, who's the European Union's foreign policy chief, for want of a better description, let me ask you what you think of what you've heard from the other two guests so far.
No, I actually agree a lot. So I was being way too diplomatic when I started out, but you did also introduce me as a former diplomat. And so I would agree with the assessment that it's too late. And if we have to change the military's calculus on this, we have to act relatively quickly. And the EU hasn't done that yet. So and I think that would be needed. And we actually, when you look at the trade side, EU is relatively important for Burma. I think it's the third largest trading partner. So lots of textiles, footwear, and so on go to the European Union. So so definitely, I mean, that whole relationship is important for Burma. So EU does have some levers beyond just.
So it's acting, you think, perhaps out of self-interest entirely, or just in part?
I think it's also acting EU-like, that EU is just, I've worked in that machinery and year after year back in the zeros in the north, sort of done the sort of renewal of EU sanctions on Burma. It just takes a long time to coordinate between 27 member countries. It's different from the US, where this is a process that goes through State Department and Treasury in order to sort of block assets and do visa bans. It just also takes quite a bit of time inside the EU, particularly when it's individual persons that need to go on a list and each of the member states.
The European Union to some extent. This is what Joseph Borrell had to say about some kind of targeted sanctions. We took the political agreement to apply sanctions targeting the military responsible for the coup and their economic interest. All direct financial support from our development system to the government reform programs is withheld. And Jonas, you talked about targeting the business interests of members of the military, and Anna talked about how visa bans and asset freezes make no difference to them because they don't travel very much and they don't have many interests in Europe. What kind of business interests might they have that could be heard?
Well, if you see the American sanctions, they include 3 companies that are pretty closely tied to the military. That could be an inspiration, for the EU, and there could be other companies as well. I mean, basically, the military in Burma is not just the military; it's also one that has sprawling financial interest, also linked to sort of specific persons at top of the. So it's also about targeting them because, as Anna was saying, if they don't go on holiday in Europe and don't have any assets here, then that part of the sanctions don't really touch them. But whereas sort of targeting their businesses that might have, that could be otherwise more effective.
Who wants to have a go at this one? China's interest in this, pretty close to the military in Myanmar, and yet it's been suggested not very happy with what it's seen happening in the last 6 weeks with the coup. Is that one for you, Ronan?
Well, China's interest in Myanmar is stability. That would be the number one Chinese government priority when it comes to the country of Myanmar. They worked very hard to develop strong relationships with Aung San Suu Kyi. But perhaps ironically, that this is an instance where a Chinese neighbour's democratic interests are rubbing up against China's interests in stability. China's ensured that its ambassadors have made statements in state media. The Chinese ambassador to Myanmar said, this is absolutely not what China wants to see. That stands as a very strong statement from China on a coup that's occurred in a neighbouring country. China will be, I think, concerned about what's now happening within Myanmar because of the demographics of the country. Myanmar's really a very young country, and it's clear from the protests that the aspirations of its young people are for democracy. And that means that those demographic aspirations are going to continue to rub up against the military's desire for absolute power. Now, that's a recipe for long-term instability within Myanmar, and that is definitely not what China will want to see in that country.
Well, I'm wondering here whether, in fact, the European Union is waiting to see what China's take on all this is, because the European Union itself has interests with China, doesn't want to upset that country, new trade deal just signed. Is it hanging back out of expediency to see what others are going to do?
Well, I think China's made very clear what its view is in terms of the coup. I think they've signalled strongly to both people within Myanmar as much as they can, and to the military leaders, that they're pretty uncomfortable with this outcome. It doesn't serve China's interests. And the EU will be fully aware that those soft statements from China represent a clear presentation of what China's view is. What the slow approach of the EU looks like is that it looks like they're just waiting to see what the outcome is within Myanmar. And that may require them not to be forced to make tough decisions. And that's, I think, a pretty poor form in this instance. I mean, the people of Myanmar overwhelmingly have made very clear what their desires are. They do not want military control, and they're looking for allies internationally. And the EU's got some form in terms of developing links with Myanmar's military. The EU's official residence in Yangon is, I think, still rented from the family of the former dictator who launched a coup in 1962 that brought in half a century of military rule. So the EU's got some ground to make up within Myanmar, and it should be doing that now and doing it urgently.
So, Anna, let's talk about the protesters, because to some extent they are succeeding more than many people had anticipated. And if there is a swell of international support for them, perhaps that is the signal that the European Union is looking for, that it is a citizens' movement. Is it working that way?
It definitely is a citizens' movement. And I think if we're talking about what the sort of calculations of the military have been, before they launched the coup, they definitely would have made calculations. And I think they have definitely underestimated what the level of resistance is throughout the country. It's not just the protests that we're seeing out on the streets. There's a general strike that is having a really big impact, particularly among sort of civil servants. There's a boycott of military products. So the scale of the resistance and opposition to this coup is enormous. But I think in terms of the EU response, as Ronan was saying, they definitely have form. EU policy on Burma has been pretty poor for many years now. Even in response to genocide of the Rohingya, the EU response was again just these visa bans and asset freezes. And again, this sort of has been given a green light to the military that, you know, in their assessment of actions they can take, that they can get
I think
away.
it was called everything but arms. In other words, unless we give you weapons, you can have anything you like.
Yes, well, that's one measure actually that we do want to see kept, because, you know, the kind of sanctions that people in Burma are calling for are targeted. They want them targeted on the economic interests of the military. Everything but arms trade preferences, you know, we think should actually stay, because removing them would impact most ordinary workers, particularly garment factory workers. What the EU needs to do is be, you know, specific and targeted. The military have vast business empires. You know, they have MEC, MEHL, and this is what the international community, including the EU, should be targeting in terms of their sanctions. And this should just be the very first step. You know, we're now a month in. This is one that should have been one of the very first actions that they take, is, you know, targeting the economic interests of the military, not just of individuals, but as the military as an institution. You know, we need to see the EU get behind building a coalition for a global arms embargo. We need to see them building support for referring Burma to the International Criminal Court. You know, there are many things that can be done. You know, as I was saying, the resistance inside the country, that's what will make a key difference, and people in Burma are doing everything they can to stop this coup working. But we certainly can't say that the international community is stepping up and playing their part to support that at the moment.
Difficult one, though, isn't it? Jonas, this one's for you, could be for anybody, but so do jump in. It's a tightrope, because the West won't want to see Myanmar, Burma fall into China's orbit of influence any more than it already is. And at the same time, it's being urged to clamp down on the military there. And if it does that, it could push it further towards China.
No, that is definitely a dilemma. I think it's one that's equally felt in Washington, and we saw that during earlier periods before the Burmese Spring in 2011 onwards, when we had sanctions on, that definitely sort of Chinese company moved in whenever the EU strengthened sanctions, sort of during the late 90s and early zeros. So I think that if we were to move to broader sanctions, that could definitely be a thing to consider, plus the geopolitical. I would say the answer there is also to work more with democracies in the region on this. I mean, there actually the EU took a pretty decent step, that Borrell, the EU's foreign chief, reached out yesterday to Indonesia's foreign minister, the biggest democracy in the region, and that's also kind of the leading in ASEAN, the sort of association of Southeast Asian nations that includes Myanmar. And try to sort of get them as well to put pressure when the ASEAN ministers, foreign ministers that are actually meeting today, or have probably met in Asian time today, and to get them to put more pressure on Burma as well, because they're their immediate neighbors and are the ones that does include sort of democracies, and therefore should sort of stand up for the democratic aspirations of where the Burmese people want to go back to.
Ronan, I want to talk to you about your impressions of Aung San Suu Kyi. I remember very clearly the day she came to Oxford in the UK, a city not 15, 20 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. And since she was applauded around the streets, and since then her reputation has suffered quite considerably, not least to do with the Rohingya people up in Rakhine State. Do you think the people of Myanmar, Burma, really do still believe she is the future?
Not the way they did before. I mean, obviously, Aung San Suu Kyi's international reputation deserves to be in tatters. She defended the military's genocidal actions against the Rohingya in 2017 and continued to defend them right up to her volunteering to appear as a representative of Myanmar at the International Court of Justice to defend the military against accusations of genocide. Within Myanmar, though, what I think has occurred is she's popular among obviously her party's supporters still maintain that she's their leader, and she's very popular among them. But her party has not managed to undertake really any meaningful generational change over the last 20 years. Myanmar's a young country, and the National League for Democracy is not a young party. And what we're seeing on the streets of Myanmar are young people organising protests. And what they want is they want a more mature democracy in Myanmar that goes beyond the sorts of compromises that Aung San Suu Kyi was prepared to make. And that's,
well, let
think,
me
a
ask
very
Anna, because I
positive thing.
saw her. I'm sorry for interrupting, Ronan, but I saw Anna nodding in agreement with what you were saying. Do they, the people, the protesters on the street, need a new figurehead? And if that is the case, is there somebody or a movement in the wings waiting?
It's an interesting question, and I agree with what Ronan was saying, that there is, a new generation. Aung San Suu Kyi, among the kind of Burman population, it still remains incredibly popular. We've seen her picture on all the streets, but I think the younger generation, they don't want to go back to the status quo. It's not for them a question of just honouring the election results from last November and bringing Aung San Suu Kyi back into power. They want much broader change. They don't want the military-backed constitution, for example. And also, we've got to bring in ethnic voices here, because Aung San Suu Kyi maybe is popular among many Burman supporters, but among ethnic groups, she's really failed to understand and listen and respond to the needs and demands of ethnic people who want a federal democracy, greater rights, and for them, they have never stopped being under attack. Even under the sort of years of Aung San Suu Kyi in government, many ethnic people were under attack by the military regime. So I think we do have also a younger generation who understand this need more, and that without this respect for ethnic and federal rights, there's never going to be genuine peace and justice in Burma. And so I think we see that coming out from these protests as well. But in terms of a party or leadership to step in at the moment, that's not there at the moment. But we're certainly seeing things develop.
Jonas, is there any indication within Europe itself that they are examining what we've just heard from Anna there, the suggestion that it needs to be, and from Ronan's session, it needs to be a different type of democracy in Myanmar? And are they sort of coming up with any ideas?
I think they can make the analysis as well, but whether they are changing in the sense that the elections right now, that you could say that the military kind of stole by launching this coup, were basically still the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi. So in that sense, returning to the situation before the coup would be meaning getting them back into sort of a leadership role. So I don't see it, but I completely agree with that it's a very sort of octogenarian party, sort of the NLD, and it does need a complete sort of changeover. And the young people here on the street shows that the last 10 years of liberalization in Burma have actually meant that a new generation has grown up, and that doesn't necessarily want the same sort of compromises with the military. Problem is the military is still as strong and is now showing that it didn't even want that sort of maybe relatively weak compromises that it had already made with Aung San Suu Kyi in order to make a sort of power sharing agreement.
Okay, Ronan, we're coming towards the end of the program, returning to her personally. If her time is up in the eyes of the protesters on the street, are sanctions going to make any kind of difference to bringing about change in Myanmar, particularly sanctions that might be imposed by the European Union, or is that it?
No, I think that targeted economic sanctions can be useful. I mean, this is an all or nothing campaign now for the military. They either win and they put down the protests, or the result of the election will be accepted, and that will be the sort of climb down that the military will not be able to tolerate, and that will effectively mean that the military will be back to the barracks, and there will have to be a renegotiated constitution. So the sanctions are pretty important. Anything that undermines the ability of the military to govern is pretty important too. There's a civil disobedience movement that's effectively shut down the banking sector, the public service, and the transport sector in Myanmar. It's making it very difficult for the military to govern. And I think that targeted sanctions that limit the military's access to foreign capital can really help with that.
Okay, Anna, final word to you. We've got about a minute or so to go in the programme. Targeted sanctions or not, do you believe that Aung San Suu Kyi's time is done?
I think, I think there will be a time, a new generation needs to have their voices heard, and she has not been representing either, the new generation or those ethnic voices. So I think we definitely, the younger generation want to see change that she has not been either able or willing to bring.
Well, we wait to see what the European Union does, and then we will wait to analyse why it has done what it has done, if it has done anything at all. Rather Donald Rumsfeld of me there. But listen, thank you very much indeed for taking part in the programme. Great to have you on the show, and wherever you happen to be watching this, we thank you for your company. From me, David Foster, from the Roundtable team. Goodbye for now.